live again. I'm mustering up the courage to do some hardcore reading here. I was able to file my claim for my truck. Hopefully I get that sorted out ASAP. I left a comment on a guy. I like Kevin's channel. He's hardcore promoting his book. I thought, hey, maybe I could read your book online and then I'm going to interview you afterwards. Be interesting. Yeah. Regardless, I'm going to bash on because I said I was going to read this book. It's been a lot of reading, man, and gonna blaze a J too. I've got, I think it's Dirty Burger. Yeah, Indica. So that's probably like the Trailer Park Boys. Well, that's Fraser Valley, it says. Oh. But that's pretty much what it is. So anyways, I'm almost done this. As you see, I'm at the 13th part of this series. And what would be really cool is, like I say, once this is done, to be able to interview that Kevin himself. But I'm going to continue on with chapter 13, FBI and the Law. And it's from Brutal, Kevin Weeks's untold story of his life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob. Yeah, nice. We've got somebody here watching, gave us a thumbs up. Fire's out today. There's Rio, my love. Oh man, I love that dog. Fire's out. Look how handsome. Huh. We were able to get out today. Actually, the weather's been kind of crap lately, but we've had quite heavy rains. And after the heavy snow, I had the fire blazing here, but I let it go out overnight last night just because it's a lot warmer today. So yeah, I got the fire's off today, but I got the space heater, so I was like, I'm in my jacket too today, just keep a little bit warmer here because it's colder now with the fire off. So I'm going to carry on. I'm on page 237, and this is chapter 13th, and we're in the 13th part of this series of Kevin Weeks's book, Brutal. FBI and the Law. For years, I had assumed that FBI agent John Connolly and his boss, John Morris, the supervisor of the Bureau's organized crime squad in Boston, were on the take. Jimmy and Stevie were always giving them money and gifts in exchange for information about what the law was doing. Jimmy even had 3 nicknames for Connolly. Elvis because of the way he combed his hair. Neighbor, since he and Jimmy had once lived in the same building at Bayshore Drive in Quincy, and Zip because Jimmy and Connolly shared the same zip code. Although I had little to do with Connolly until after Jimmy was on the run, I knew a bit about him. 11 years younger than Jimmy, he was also a son of Irish immigrants, and had grown up in Mary Ellen McCormick housing project a few doors down from the Bulger family. I'd even heard stories about how Jimmy had once bought an 8-year-old John Connolly a vanilla ice cream cone after convincing the little boy he wasn't a stranger, and a few months later had broken up a fight where Connolly was being pummeled by an older kid. Connolly, however, had apparently been more impressed with Billy Bulger and later told me that it was Billy who had convinced him to continue his education at Boston College. He, he had started working for the FBI in the organized crime unit in New York and came to Boston office in 1973. From what I saw, Connolly was a likable guy, always laughing and amiable, uh, with a nice personality. He liked nice things and owned a house up in Thomas Park in Southie, where he lived in the top 2 floors of the house and rented out the downstairs apartment. But were times when I'd seen Jimmy get angry when he thought Connolly was spending too much money, like when the FBI agent bought a boat and a 40-footer or something with a 9.5-foot beam and twin engines. Jimmy was bullshit because he felt that Connolly was being too ostentatious, that he was flashing too much cash. How could he explain it? Connolly would say that he was single and could spend the money on himself, but Jimmy didn't buy that answer and was always telling him to tone it down. All I knew about the FBI agent John Morris was his nickname, Vino, given to him because he liked wine. The only time he got to drink expensive wine was when Jimmy and Stevie gave it to him. Jimmy told me that one night while he and Stevie were at Morris's house in Lexington, Morris had asked them for $5,000 to help with a problem he was having with his daughter. Jimmy and Stevie took the money out of their pockets and handed it to him. Even before Jimmy told me that story, I had known Morris was on the take. Jimmy also told me about a brainstorm Morris had in 1975. He'd planted explosives in the car of a Revere loan shark, Eddie Miani, as a part of his clever plan to scare Miani and develop him into an FBI informant. The bomb wasn't actually hooked up to go off, but it was a real one, and the Revere police considered it an attempted murder case. But Morris's plan didn't work out, and the attempt to recruit Miami was unsuccessful. I certainly got to know Connolly a lot better than Morris, but that didn't happen till some years passed. The first time I met him was in 1978 at the L Street Bathhouse in Southie, a building on the beach where people used to work out, with a private area for members to sunbathe and swim in the ocean. That day, I had just finished working out with Johnny Pretzi, and was walking out of the building with Connolly when Connolly was heading in it. I'd seen Connolly around, but had never spoken to him. He stopped the two of us. Pretzi introduced us, and we shook hands and said, "Hi, how are you?" That was pretty much all that ever passed between the two of us until 6 years later in 1984, when Connolly came into the liquor store, walked over to me and asked, "What's going on?" I didn't really answer him, but when Jimmy got back to the store, I said to him, "Can you imagine that cocksucker asking me what's going on?" Jimmy snapped back at me, "That guy is a friend of ours. Don't ever talk about him like that. You want him to think that that's what we say about him?" I figured he was corrupt and we were paying him for information from the FBI, and Jimmy must have just wanted me to be more careful not to disturb that relationship. Of course, at that time, I had no idea whatsoever of the real bond between these two men. After Connolly had retired from the FBI in 1990, Jimmy told me about a trip the two of them had taken years earlier to Mexico, most probably to get out of town during the blizzard of '78. Apparently, Jimmy had been driving and they had an accident. He didn't get hurt, but Connolly ended up with a black eye. A black eye. Wonder if that might have been or have made anyone look twice. Here was an FBI agent and Boston's most notorious criminal vacationing together. While Jimmy and Connolly always appeared to have an amicable relationship, Jimmy had reason to be mad enough to take care of Morris. In 1988, four Globe reporters, Jerry O'Neill, Dick Lear, Christine Chinland, and Kevin Cullen, published a four-part series on the Bulger brothers, with one installment devoted to the special relationship between Whitey and the FBI. It got back to Jimmy later that during an interview with Jerry O'Neill at Venezuela's, or not Venezuela's, Venezia's restaurant in Dorchester Bay, Morris had told the Globe reporter that Jimmy was an informant and said how dangerous he was, adding that Connolly and Bulger were close, perhaps too close. Morris had also described a dinner at Stevie's mother's house with Billy Bulger, Jimmy, Morris, and Connolly. Although the word informant wasn't used in the actual Globe series, it was implied by the mention of special relationship in the sentence. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation has for years had a special relationship with Bulger that has divided law enforcement bitterly and poisoned relationships among many investigators. When Jimmy read the published article in the Globe in September of '88, he was bullshit. It's funny how they use that term, anyways, he was bullshit. I guess that means he was angry. But no one believed the story, and we figured it was probably just another way of getting back at Billy Bulger through his brother, smearing Billy's reputation by proximity after a recent probe of a downtown office development deal at 75 State Street. I certainly did not believe it because I knew the FBI was giving us information and telling us everything that was going on. The idea that Jimmy or Stevie would be giving them information was unthinkable. After all, we were the ones paying them. Years later, it wasn't hard to figure out why Morris would leak such information. He had been corrupted by Jimmy and Stevie and compromised as an FBI agent and handler. He was also terrified of Jimmy's violence, that he feared for his own life. Afraid that he was in over his head, Morris was worried that someone in the organized crime was planning to kill him. Jimmy felt that Morris had put out the information that Jimmy was an informant in the hopes that someone would now try and kill Jimmy and Morris's problem would be over. Eventually, Morris admitted to the agency that he had leaked the information and was given a 2-week suspension after the article appeared in the Globe. Jimmy had always known that Morris was afraid of him. He also knew that Morris was jealous of Connolly. Years earlier, Connolly had gotten some sort of a grant to attend a special program at Harvard, and Morris had felt slighted that he had been passed over for the privilege. But Jimmy's wrath at learning that Morris had told stories about him to the Globe was huge. But it was typical of Jimmy not to act on his anger right away. Rather than show his hand to a weak weasel like Morris, he filed the information away for future use, never forgetting that Morris was the leak. 7 years later, Jimmy put it on him. In October of 1995, while he was on the lam, Jimmy called from out of state to tell me exactly what he had done. He had spent a little time calling around and had finally located Morris at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. When he first tried to call him there, an operator at Quantico told him that Morris was busy. "Tell him Mr. White called," he told the operator, certain Morris would get the reference to Whitey. "Tell him I'll call back." An hour later, Jimmy called back, and this time he got Morris on the phone. "You started this fucking thing," he told him. "Use your Machiavellian mind and straighten this out, because if I go down, I'm taking you down with me." It had to terrify Morris that Jimmy, on the run, had found out exactly where he was. Morris, of all people, knew what a dangerous man Jimmy was. And now he knew that Jimmy Bulger could find him no matter where he was. When I told Connolly about the conversation, he laughed and said he had a heart attack a couple of days ago. He died twice on the table. It must have been some phone call, but instead of retracting the Globe story or dying on the table, Morris recovered enough to seek immunity from prosecution, and years later went on to testify against John Connolly. As for my relationship with Connolly, things changed drastically between the two of us in 1996. 2 years earlier, in 1994, Connolly had come to the liquor store to tell me that Jimmy and Stevie were about to be indicted. But once Stevie was in jail and Jimmy was gone, I saw a great deal more of Connolly. Our frequent meetings, which probably numbered more than 36, began in 1996 and continued until I got pinched in November of 1999. The first meeting took place in Harvard Square when Stevie, who was locked up in Plymouth, gave me the number to call to reach out to Connolly. Stevie wanted me to find out what was going on with the investigation, what the state police and DEA were doing. Connolly informed me that the DEA and state police who were working together were not getting along with the FBI, that cooperation was at the lowest point ever. He said he'd try and find out more and would let me know. The next time I visited Stevie at Plymouth, I gave him that information. Pretty interesting, eh, Rio? At our next two meetings, which were at a restaurant bar in Cambridge called Finnegan's Wake, John and I were basically talking about witnesses and the case they had against Jimmy and Stevie. He kept telling me that the feds had a weak case, that they had nothing, that they had nothing there, that the case was going to fall apart. We also discussed witnesses, their health, and which ones had already died. When I wanted to set up a meeting or speak to Connolly, I would call his office and say it was Chico calling. If he wanted to get in touch with me, we would call a relative of mine who would call me up and tell me that my girlfriend was looking for me. That was my relative's way of joking with me. After our first few meetings in Cambridge, the rest of my meetings with Connolly were held in the evenings at the top of the Hub restaurant on the 52nd floor of the Prudential building, where Boston Edison had its business offices. We'd meet around 5:30, eat and talk. At each meeting, he committed to keep me informed about the different witnesses. Chico Krantz's health was failing. Another bookmaker, Eddie Lewis, was also in bad health. George Kaufman had already died of natural causes. Frank Salemi Jr. had also died. The only one thing Jimmy Carts had said was that he believed the money he gave to George Kaufman was going to Whitey and Stevie, which wasn't really wasn't really a damaging statement. More and more, we continue to hear that the case was falling apart. One fall day in 1996, while I was visiting Stevie, he wrote down a number and held it up to the window for me to write down. Call the number, he told me. He got get a hold of Eric, ask for Dick, say you're a friend of Paul's. Excuse me. That night I followed his instructions and set up a meeting with Dick for the following Thursday night at the old Braintree Drive-In. That night Dick walked out of the small blue foreign car with his Rottweiler, about 5'10", in his mid-60s. He was heavy-set with silver hair, glasses, a pudgy round face. "Are you Dick?" I asked him. "You must be the infamous Kevin Weeks," he answered. "I don't know about that," I said, "but I am Kevin Weeks." This Dick was the man Stevie had always referred to as Eric, but I had never known his real name. Stevie spoke about Eric a lot, about how he was a state police officer and was tipping him off about the joint state police, DEA, and FBI investigations. In actuality, he might have been more important to Stevie than John Connolly. Jimmy had several other sources in the FBI, but Dick was the only one connected to the state police. Dick was in a sensitive position where a lot of information on the investigation and its budget approval went uh, directly across his desk. At our first meeting, I talked to him about the investigation and what was going on with the state police. After he put the dog back in the car, the two of us stood outside in the cool fall air and continued to talk. I hadn't been afraid of the dog. I had a pistol with me and would have shot him if there had been any problem. That night, Dick reaffirmed what Connolly had told me, that the FBI and state police were at their lowest point of cooperation. He said he would find out what he could and get back to me. I met with him about a dozen times, usually in the same place. He told me he had a counterpart in the Rhode Island State Police, as well as some other sources. And he was going to see what he could find out about the investigation. I told Stevie whatever he told me and repeated the information to Jimmy whenever he called. But with each new meeting, I got the feeling that Dick didn't know much and was jerking me around. It seemed to be a waste of time. I feel like I got a hair in my eye. Not that I have any hair. It seemed to be a waste of time to meet with him, but Stevie wanted me to continue. One night, Dick and I were talking about books, and I told him I was reading a book by Vinnie Teresa called My Life in the Mafia, and he told me he was in the book. I went home that night and finished the book. In it, the only mention of anybody in that state police was a Richard Schneiderhan. So now I knew Dick's and Eric's real name. After our 12th meeting, I decided the meetings were a waste of time. Dick was giving me bits and pieces, but for the most part, I felt he was trying to distance himself from the whole thing. He'd gotten a lot of money over the years from Stevie, but now with Stevie in jail and Jimmy on the run, there was nothing they could do financially for him. He was just placating them with lip service and nothing more. Jimmy used to brag that he could ask 6 FBI agents to jump into his car with machine guns, but Schneiderhan was Stevie's one state police connection. Eventually, Schneiderhan was arrested and convicted. His final stay was recently denied, and he's going to have to go to jail for 18 months. However, in the spring of 1997, less than a year after I had started to meet with Connolly, I got some news that literally shattered my world. One night while I was home reading a book and watching the 10 o'clock news on Channel 56, I heard that Stevie Fleming had gotten up on the stand at the evidentiary hearings in front of Judge Wolf and announced that he and Jimmy were FBI informants and had been given immunity from prosecution. Then they had been told they could commit any crime short of murder. I dropped the book I had in my hands, put my feet down on the floor, and leaned forward yelling, "What the fuck?" Stunned, there was nothing I could do except sit there on my couch, flipping the channels and waiting until the 11 o'clock news to make sure I had heard it right. When the broadcast repeated the news, I kept shaking my head in disbelief. As I got up to grab a beer and kept flipping some more, waiting for the 2 o'clock news and reruns I might get, all I kept thinking was, did I get it right? How could that be possible? After the 2 o'clock news, I turned off the TV, still unable to believe that I had heard it right, unable to understand the whole thing. It made no sense. We killed guys because they were informants, and now I was learning that Jimmy and Stevie were informants themselves. The next day, I went out and got a paper, and there it was in black and white: Jimmy and Stevie, FBI informants. For 25 years, I had believed that Jimmy was corrupting the FBI through greed and money, paying them for information to help us. But I couldn't deny what I had just seen and read. Sure, I knew that the media all too frequently got it wrong or outright lied. But this time Stevie had said on the stand under oath that he and Jimmy were FBI informants. The words had come right from his mouth, not from a reporter's pen. It was incomprehensible. I thought about how intelligent Jimmy was. how he had always turned percentages in his favor. But we had always said the criminals take the good with the bad. You don't give up on your friends. I knew that a lot of criminals had connections in law enforcement and that they were given information in return for money and favors, but it was not supposed to be the other way. I had really liked and respected Jimmy. He had treated me well, but I couldn't understand this. You don't cooperate with law enforcement. If you have enemies, you don't talk about them to law enforcement. Rather, you take it to the street and handle it that way. You don't rat on them and sick the law on them. You don't eliminate the competition that way. Much later, I came up with my own theory on why Jimmy might have become an FBI informant, that he had been coerced into it by crimes he had committed with Stevie. But on that spring day, I was still reeling from shock of finding out that 25 years of my life had been a lie. After I got the papers, I went down to the store and talked to Kevin O'Neill, who was as shocked as I was, in disbelief himself. Kevin had no idea what was going on. I tried to find a few other people and see if they had heard what I had. Some people hadn't heard it, and those who had no idea what was going on. But most of the people around us couldn't believe it. The only thing all of us knew was that we were the ones getting info. A few said they had suspected it but could never prove it. I had never even thought of it. But the one thing I knew for sure was that I now had a problem. People would be thinking I had something to do with these two guys being informants. No one was saying anything, but from that minute on, I was walking around with two pistols to protect myself. I made sure I had plenty of firepower, usually carrying 245s or 238s. I kept the pistols in my waistband or inside my uh, coat pocket. I wore a coat with the pockets cut out, so when my hands were inside the coat, they were actually on my pistols. The night after I heard the news, Stevie called me at 8, the way he usually did. As always, there was the recorded voice informing us that the call was being taped. Stevie, in his usual cheerful mode, I would say mood, but mode, having just finished another day in the hearings. Everything was hunky-dory, nothing was wrong. What's going on? I asked him. Oh, that thing you heard was nothing, he told me. Wait till the whole story comes out. The next day I went up to Plymouth to see him. At that time, I was usually going once a week, as with his brother Mikey, his sons Stevie Jr. and Billy and Phil Costa. I sat down opposite the glass partition separating the two of us and picked up the phone. What are you doing? I asked Stevie. I know what I'm doing, he told me. Don't worry about it. Do you put a bullseye on my back? I asked him. I've been around you all these years and now you're putting a bullseye on me. You weren't involved in all that, he said. You don't have to worry. It's nothing. Wait till the whole story comes out. Stevie, I said to him, it's all over the news that you and Jimmy are informants. Well, we never said anything about you, he said. That's when I put the phone down and said, right into the glass partition, how could you? Everything I did with the two of you. He couldn't give me up without giving himself up. The next time I saw John Connolly at the top of the hub, he too told me to wait until I heard the whole story. The mafia was going against Jimmy and Stevie, he said. So Jimmy and Stevie went against them. He had a 3-inch thick leather case with him filled with 302 reports the field agents filed regularly that he had written up on Jimmy and Stevie. Obviously, since he had retired from the FBI 7 years earlier, he had made copies of the reports for his own personal files. There were lots and lots of them, but he took out all the papers and I started going through them. The reports discussed things about the mafia, but there was also stuff about friends of ours, about Irish guys, members of Winter Hill, guys Jimmy and Stevie had given up. I looked at Connolly and said, they were giving up everybody. No, they weren't, he said, pointing out some letters on the pages I was holding. Look at the bottom of each report, see? Not to be disseminated without case agent's approval. No one could see them without me. I had to approve anyone looking at these reports, but I knew that was bullshit because some of those people had already been arrested for the same exact crimes that were listed in the reports. There's nothing in there about Connolly. There's nothing in there about you, Connolly told me as I continued, incredulous, to read over hundreds of reports. Again, those words didn't mean anything to me because everything I had done with Jimmy and Stevie. There was nothing they could say about me without incriminating themselves. As I read over the files at the top of the hub that night, Connolly kept telling me that 90% of the information in the files came from Stevie. Certainly Jimmy hadn't been around the mafia the way Stevie had, but Connolly told me he had to put Jimmy's name on the files to keep his file active. As long as Jimmy was an active informant, Connolly said he could justify meeting with Jimmy to give him valuable information. Even after he retired, Connolly still had friends in the FBI, and he and Jimmy kept meeting to let each other know what was going on. I listened to all of that, but now I also understood that even though he was retired, Connolly was still getting information as well as money from Jimmy. As I continued to read, I could see that a lot of the reports were not just against the Italians. There were more and more names of Polish and Irish guys, of people we had done business with, of friends of mine. Whenever I came across the name of someone I knew, I would read exactly what it said about the person. I would see over and over the same of that some of these people had been arrested for crimes that were mentioned in these reports. It didn't take me long to realize again that it had been bullshit when Connolly had told me that the files hadn't been discriminated, that they had been for his own personal disseminated, that they had been for his own personal use. He had been an employee of the FBI. He hadn't worked for himself. If there was an investigation going on and his supervisor said, let me take a look at that, what was Connolly going to say? He had to give it up, and he obviously had. I thought about what Jimmy had always said. You can lie to your wife and to your girlfriends, but not to your friends. Not to anyone we were in business with. Maybe Jimmy and Stevie hadn't lied to me, but they sure hadn't been telling me everything. Soon after that, Stevie actually mentioned my name at his hearing in front of Judge Wolf. When he took the stand, he was asked, "How are you corresponding with John Connolly now?" He answered, "Through Kevin Weeks." When I read it in the paper, I was bullshit again. I guess that means he was angry, pissed right off. It was the first time my name had been brought up in the courtroom. Nice of him to put another fucking bullseye on my back when I was out there helping him. I had no choice but to continue to help Stevie because if he flipped on me, I was gone. I was getting life. I was hostage to him, walking a thin line because I had to placate Stevie and what he was doing in his case, while on the street I had to distance myself from him. But after that day in court, in the courtroom, I realized Stevie didn't give a fuck about me. All Stevie was worried about was Stevie. A short time later, Stevie asked me to help him get some evidence suppressed that was being used against him. In particular, there were tapes of Stevie and Frankie Salemi that had been obtained through a roving bug that had been placed in a house at 34 Guild Street in Medford. On October 29th, 1989, the tapes had secretly recorded for the first time ever a mafia induction ceremony for four made guys. Stevie alleged that there had been no need to set up the roving bug, which is the most intrusive form of surveillance available. The need for a roving bug had been based on the fact that the FBI didn't know where the induction ceremony would take place. However, the truth was they had known 7 to 10 days beforehand exactly where the ceremony would be. But the FBI was so paranoid of leaks in the office getting back to the mafia that they lied to the U.S. Attorney Diane Kottmeyer, the strike force chief who was overseeing the case, and said they didn't know where the ceremony would take place. They also didn't inform the judge that they had informants who were going to be at the ceremony who could have been wired up. It was just another case of the ends justifying the means. Stevie wanted to show that the FBI had broken the law, and therefore everything obtained on the roving bug should be thrown out. Stevie wanted me to find out exactly when the FBI had gone to the Department of Corrections to make sure Vinny Federico, who was one of the four men scheduled to be inducted, was granted a furlough from MCI Shirley so he could attend the ceremony at a relative's house on Guild Street. Stevie also wanted the names and file numbers of the top echelon informants, the high-ranking members of organized crime that the FBI had used to get that authorization for the roving bug. When I asked Connolly for the names of these informants, he told me four of them were his, including Jimmy, Stevie, Sonny, Mercurio, and a Meg guy from Boston who later died of cancer. The fifth one, a member of the Rhode Island Mafia, Anthony the Saint Laurent, belonged to Billy Shea, the FBI agent from Rhode Island. When I got the identities of all five informants, along with the rest of the information from Connolly, I told it to Stevie when I visited him at Plymouth. Personally, back in 1989, I had never known anything about the induction ceremony. Jimmy and Stevie had been involved or Jimmy and Stevie had been involved, but I never heard about it till it was over. About a week after the ceremony took place, Jimmy and Stevie had been talking about it, saying how the feds got the whole ceremony on tape. They had heard how someone was leaving had said, only the ghosts know what happened here that night. Oh, yeah, Stevie had said to Jimmy, only the ghosts and the feds. When I had heard them talking about it like that, I figured they had learned what had happened from the feds and were not personally involved. Since at that point I didn't know the true relationship between Jimmy and Stevie and the FBI. As far as I knew, it was a one-way street, and the feds were giving us information. Now I understood that Stevie and Jimmy's involvement in the ceremony must have boosted their importance as FBI informants. As it turned out, the evidence intercepted at the Guild Street was presented to the grand juries that indicted Stevie. At one of our meetings at the top of the hill, or at the top of the hub, Connolly showed me a letter he had drafted on a legal pad to U.S. District Court Judge Mark Wolf. Wolf's hearings in the racketeering case against Jimmy and Stevie were still going on, but Stevie's lawyers were not making any headway in their attempts to set up a pretrial hearing in front of the judge. They were getting nowhere in their attempts to get the charges dropped against Jimmy and Stevie and to get their cases thrown out. In Connolly's letter, the source, three unnamed Boston police officers falsely accused retired Detective Sergeant Frank Doohan of fabricating evidence against Bulger and Fleming. Doohan had been a zealot obsessed with getting Stevie and Jimmy. A zealot. Everything that happened in town, Doohan blamed on us, and 99% of the time he was wrong. But he saw someone talking to us. That guy was automatically an associate. If a cop from the neighborhood waved to us, he was corrupt. If someone got killed, we did it or we ordered it. He saw Jimmy's handprints on everything that happened, and that just wasn't true. Connolly's letter included examples of how the government had corrupted its case by planting evidence to get us. He included the story of John Morris planting a bomb under Eddie Miani's car in 1975. John gave me the letter to read over to see if I had any ideas or anything else to put into it, and I added a few things to it. I added the story of David Lindholm, a known drug dealer we had shaken down, whose nickname on the street was Little Lies because he was known to not tell the truth. Connolly typed the phony letter on his computer on the Boston Police Department stationery that I got for him from a source I had there. The 3.5-page letter succeeded in convincing Judge Wolf that the government was using illegal evidence to get us. At the time of the letter, there were only 2 or 3 days left before the judge had to make his ruling, and the letter prompted him to grant Stevie a pretrial hearing right away. Eventually, Connolly was convicted of obstruction of justice in writing the letter to the judge, but at the time, it did succeed in convincing the judge to allow the hearing. The whole scene makes sense when makes me wonder how things work when the situation is reversed and law enforcement uses the media to leak stories so they can create talk on the street. That way they can gather evidence even though the initial evidence they put out is blatantly false. When the law does that type of planting, it is not considered illegal, but rather a tactic, a tool of the investigation. When someone like Connolly does it, it is merely illegal. Jimmy had told me stories about FBI agents, but in all of these stories, they were the ones giving us the information. In one such story, FBI agent Dennis Condon had set up Edward Punchy McLaughlin, one of the three Charleston McLaughlin brothers, during the Winter Hill McLaughlin gang war in October of 1965. Condon approached McLaughlin and told him, "Tell your brothers to calm down." McLaughlin turned around and said, "Worry about your own brother, the fucking drunk." A night or two later, Condon called up Stevie and told him exactly where McLaughlin got the bus every morning. The next day, Stevie showed up at the bus stop holding a paper bag from which he pulled out a gun, walked across the street and shot and killed him. That night, Condon called up Stevie and said, "Nice shooting." Frank Salemi testified that FBI agent Paul Rico, who was Condon's partner, had also given him and Stevie information about McLaughlin's whereabouts. Rico helped Stevie many more times, but he had been especially helpful in 1968 when Stevie had been on the lam for the Fitzgerald car bombing, letting Stevie know when it was safe for him to return to Boston in 1974. Years later, in the 1990s, federal prosecutor Jeremiah O'Sullivan was leading an investigation against Jimmy and Stevie and Winter Hill. Jimmy told me how John Connolly ran into O'Sullivan one day in the post office in Post Office Square. O'Sullivan said to O'Connolly, "There is an investigation going on with your boys." John turned around and said, "They already know that." How could Jimmy know that? O'Sullivan said. It was It was funded by my office. Obviously, O'Sullivan didn't know about Connolly's two-way relationship with Jimmy, but the truth was that O'Sullivan was tipping off Connolly about the investigation. During the Wolf hearings, when O'Sullivan was scheduled to testify about his role in the investigation, the federal prosecutor suffered a heart attack, which couldn't have come at a better time for him. After the hearings were over, he made a speedy recovery. Uh, During these hearings, Stevie testified that John Morris had given him a tape recording in the 1980s. He felt that the fact that Morris had gave him the tape would help support his claim that he was working with the FBI. That, in fact, what he was listening to the tapes, the FBI with the FBI agent. Stevie was also blaming everything on Morris, testifying that Morris gave him the tip-off about the imminent arrest, which of course wasn't true. He was trying to keep Connolly's identity in the tip-off secret when it, in fact, Connolly was the one who told me about the coming indictments. When I was meeting Connolly at the top of the hub, he gave me the tape that Morris had left behind. When I then gave to Stevie's attorneys. In fact, if Stevie had just told the truth about Connolly in the first place, it would have helped his case instead of hurting it. Of course, Stevie had expected Connolly to say something to help his case. Perhaps that was why he was trying to protect him about the tip-off. However, on April 30th, 1998, during one of his two courtroom appearances during the Wolf hearings, Connolly, afraid of incriminating himself and being charged with crimes, had invoked the Fifth Amendment after every question he was asked. He refused to bolster Stevie's contention that the FBI assured him and Jimmy that they could commit crime short of murder so long as they provided information on the mafia. Hello, Stock Explorer. Thank you for your comment. At work, but I have your video running in the background. Oh, that's nice. Thank you. I am staying warm. It's not that bad, but it just gets kind of chilly in here. This is the last little bit here of this chapter. Hello, Riv. Lear, see, it's almost 4 o'clock. Well, it's 3:30, but around 3:30 or 3:28. Around 3:30 is when they're going to start pestering me because 4 o'clock is supper time. So that's when they get their supper. The three of them are like my alarm clock. Oh, there she is. Riv. Now Rio always gets jealous. You can hear him there because he always wants all the attention. Okay, so I'm going to continue on here on page 254. Lear and O'Neill, the Globe reporters who had written the 4-part series on the Bulger brothers, went on to write a book, Black Mass. That's the infamous movie, based on the Wolf hearings. In their book, maybe 50% of the facts came out, and a lot of times they were taken out of context. These so-called experts didn't know anything that really happened with Jimmy and Stevie and me, but they still said certain things about me. I'd love to get those guys give those guys the opportunity to say these things to my face like a man, but that will never happen. Dick Lear is a professor at Boston University. I'd like to meet him one-on-one with no one else around besides the two of us. Then he could tell me what he thinks of me, and I could show him what I think of him. I've always believed that if you have a problem with someone, you knock on his door and say, "You have something to say to me." Okay, now what do you want to do about it? Kevin Cullen, another Globe reporter who worked on the 1998 4-part series, handled things real bravely. After his involvement in the series and the subsequent word that Jimmy would kill him, being the tough guy he was, Cullen fled to Europe. He became the London bureau correspondent. I wonder if this expert on Bulger's case is out there now looking for Jimmy in England. It's funny because we have seen this guy, this Kevin Cullen, and the 3 other reporters there on like multiple panels from these shows they do, like on Mob Facts. I see it. It's like reruns of 70s court cases and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, like this book brings it to life from Kevin's side, like his facts, I guess. Even today, it's hard to try and figure out what happened between Jimmy and Connolly. Connolly was an affable guy, but Jimmy had exposed his dark side, and their roles had become reversed. Instead of Connolly being the handler and Jimmy the informant, Jimmy had become the master and made Connolly his puppet. I had seen so little of Connolly before Stevie got arrested in early 1995, But then, until I learned the truth about Jimmy and Connolly, I had assumed that he must just be a corrupt FBI agent taking money to look out for Jimmy's interests. Once I understood their true relationship, FBI handler and FBI informant, I saw the power Jimmy had over him and understood how deeply Jimmy had corrupted him. But my days of meeting Connolly and visiting Stevie to help him with his case were coming to an end. I would soon have my own case to take care of, and the three of us would no longer have anything to discuss. If I had known earlier what the real relationship had been between the two of them, I would have gone my own way a lot sooner. But even knowing the truth about Jimmy, I couldn't hate him. Though I had been shocked and furious over what I had learned about him, it's still hard to be around someone for 25 years and not like him. Besides, you had to admire Jimmy. He beat them at their own game. Well, that's the end of that chapter. I've been going for an hour here. Yeah, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. I see 2 people are there. It'd be much appreciated. Let's see. Shall I bash on? Or shall I do another chapter later? I think I'm just going to bash on, man. 257. Yeah, that's another 20 pages. Okay, well, I think I'm going to sum up for now then, and that's the end of chapter 13. Kevin's learned that Stevie and Jimmy are really FBI informants. Can you imagine? Unbelievable. And here you are doing all these crimes with these guys. So the next chapter is chapter 14, and frankly that'll coincide with that'll probably be the final thing. That's the arrest, prison, and the release, his release, and then it's like the little where they are now kind of thing. So that's about another 30 pages to go on that, and we'll just bash on with that after I feed the dogs. Maybe a little earlier this evening we'll finish the book. It's been a very interesting read. I'm looking at a few, like I said, I'm gonna read Jay Dobbin's book No Angel next. I read it before a few years ago, and I always thought it was kind of weird, like how, like, I guess in a way it's this theme too of how there's always these cops or informants inside your criminal enterprise, right? Like, or any kind of organized enterprise. There's always some cop trying to screw you or burn you or whatever, I guess. Like, just don't trust anybody. Anyways, that's my little reading today. Or for now, that was pretty interesting. So I'm gonna sum up here, and I'll see you in the next and final part of this series of Kevin Weekes' book Brutal, the untold story of his life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish Mob. I'm out.